case, a civil servant, I am making absolutely no imputation against any single one of them whatsoever. It would be disgraceful to do so because I don't have the evidence on which to do it. But what I give way, of course, to.
I thank my honourable and learned friend for giving way. He and I have worked together, both originally as pupil master and pupil, but then as Attorney General and civil servant. So we have a great deal of history in this matter. Does he agree with me that there are civil service mechanisms and systems for guiding the behaviour of civil servants? And does he agree with me that these matters are ideally best not discussed in the manner in which we're discussing them this afternoon?
But my honourable friend is right about our long association, and she's also, of course, right because she's worked in the Treasury Solicitors Department, where I am quite sure she maintained at all times the highest standards of integrity. But the difficulty is this. The 31st of October is looming. We are, as a House, about to be prorogued and rendered entirely ineffective until the 14th of October. This is the choice of the government. The routes I might have wished to have taken to see this matter properly investigated simply do not match the time available for us to do it, and the fact that as trust has progressively broken down, I'm afraid I become increasingly concerned that the government may simply not respond in the manner in which I would expect it should if one was simply to ask polite questions. Of course, I give way.
I thank him very much for giving way, but can he tell the House whether he intends to put on the record any of the details of the information that he says he received? Because the worry is if he doesn't, and the government simply ignores this humble address, we will never know their contents, because the implication of what he's saying is really very serious, and it is this, and that's that the Queen was misled by the Prime Minister as to his reasons for wanting a prorogation.
Oh my goodness.
Well, don't agree. The honourable gentleman raises some very difficult points. I think the best thing I can do is simply to state openly the generality of it, and he is, I think, correct in what he says. That far from this prorogation being a desire to reset the government for the purposes of holding a Queen's speech and nothing else, that there is available plenty of evidence that what actually happened was that there was a concerted get-together within government to try to ensure that this House could be prevented from taking action to stop a no-deal Brexit, and that the origins of that long predate the first time the government mentioned prorogation. That is, I think, in a nutshell, what we are talking about. Yes, of course.
I have been, as he knows, in this House for 40 years. I've never heard of a more serious allegation against a government acting in a way that's misleading this House on one side and stopping the House from functioning on the other. Would you agree with that?
Well, here in 2003.
I would, but I would also emphasise, and this is why I emphasise it, that these are allegations. And in an ideal world, I would have preferred not to make allegations, even within the context of the privilege which this House provides. But I think in the circumstances, and with the time available before the 31st of October comes, and the fact we are proroguing, there really is no alternative. Now, no, I can just make a little bit of progress. So what I've attempted to do, distilling the information which has been made available, is to identify those people where I think the information may be available. And I repeat what I said, that I make no imputation against individuals whatsoever. We could have tried to be much broader, but had we been much broader, it might have looked a bit like a fishing expedition throughout government, and it seems to me only right to ask the questions as to where, in a sense, we have been directed by the information I've received and others have received, that the answers may be found. Hence the list of individuals that I have named. And as I say again, not a single imputation against any of them. What is necessary is to establish the information they possess. Of course I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my right honourable and learned friend for giving way, and we too have been friends for his entire time in this House. Having been a minister himself, is he not worried about the collateral damage that this humble address is creating? It is important that civil servants have space and safe space to speak truth to power. And I think that by his actions today, he is damaging the civil service's ability to communicate and discuss freely matters with ministers. Does he not see the damage he is doing?
Well, I understand my right honourable friend's point, and if I may say to her, that was a matter which exercised me very much before I decided to table this motion. But as against that, we also have to face up to another fact, that it cannot, those necessary protections for civil servants cannot be used and must not be used as a device to hoodwink this House and the public as to the way the government conducts its business. The government has a duty. It can sometimes have a duty not to say something, but it certainly doesn't have a right to mislead. And it is such a fundamental matter that I think we are right to pursue this issue. Of course, if it turns out, just let me make a bit of progress for a moment and I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman. If it turns out that the information I was given was mistaken, well then in those circumstances I shall be the happiest person of the lot. But I have to say I think it is sufficiently serious in its nature and content that I would be failing in my duty as a Member of Parliament if we were not to seek to ascertain whether it is correct. So I then give way to my right honourable friend.
Grateful to the right honourable learned gentleman. Surely the only thing that matters is what was in the Prime Minister's mind, what were his reasons for making the decision he made. You cannot work that out by asking for the personal testimonies of lots of officials, some of whom met the Prime Minister on this and some of whom didn't. The matter is what was in the Prime Minister's mind, and this House has ample opportunity, which is already used, to cross-examine the Prime Minister to satisfy themselves about what they think his true motive was. But I don't see how knowing what some officials thought helps at all.
If I may say to my right honourable friend, last week, at Prime Minister's questions, my right honourable friend, the member of South West Hertfordshire, and I both asked questions of the Prime Minister seeking to elucidate an answer as to his motive and state of knowledge. And I was rather struck by the fact that he avoided answering both questions completely. There was not an attempt. My right honourable friend should go and look at the Hansard. There was not a single attempt to answer the questions. So I'm afraid I don't have much confidence that my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has the capacity, frankly, to answer questions of this kind, because he doesn't appear to understand how serious they are and appears to treat them with a high level of flippancy. So for those reasons, of course I give way.
The right honourable gentleman, the learned gentleman, for giving way. Just on that point, the prorogation potentially this evening will deny the liaison committee a 3-hour session with the Prime Minister this Wednesday, a session the Prime Minister agreed to on the 14th of August.
Yes, indeed, and of course that might have provided another opportunity for asking questions. I will say this, I do appreciate that this House can sometimes be difficult and irksome to Prime Ministers and governments. But that is our job. And we are there precisely to provide scrutiny and also to hold to account. For those reasons, I don't think we are unreasonable, and it would be unreasonable of us to proceed to ask for these documents. And I believe and hope that this has been drafted in a way that is sufficiently focused that we can come swiftly to a conclusion by Wednesday as to whether or not there is anything which should be causing the public disquiet or not. Yes, I give way to my right honourable friend, of course.
Right, Robert, and learned friend for giving way. He's named 9 individuals here. He could have asked for the Cabinet Secretary, he could have asked for permanent secretaries. These names do appear to me to be very arbitrary. I know one of them. I think she's been only appointed for less than a week or 10 days. So what are his criteria for choosing these 9 particular individuals?
Well, my right honourable friend makes a very good point. There was a time at the end of last week where the list was rather longer and did actually include, I'll say this openly, senior civil servants. But I had a reticence about that, and felt as a result of the inquiries that I made that the list could best be narrowed. And it was, I think, made quite clear from the information that I had gleaned that the origins of this story as to how prorogation came about does not lie with public officials, it lies with the special advisors to ministers. And for that reason, I think that the list is as well directed as I believe it can be. Now, I want to make progress and bring my remarks to an end. That is the issue surrounding prorogation. In addition to that, we have the papers surrounding Yellowhammer. The House will remember that the government sought to suggest when the Yellowhammer papers first started to emerge, some of them, that this was material prepared for a previous administration. But it turns out that is another one of those little inaccuracies which now seems to creep out of number 10 Downing Street. It turns out that is in fact incorrect. This was material prepared for the current administration and for cabinet committees to understand the risks involved in a no-deal Brexit. Now, we are going to be prevented over the coming weeks from debating those issues, and when we return, we are going to have almost no time, and I fear very much that by the time the Queen's Speech debate is over, we are going to be mired in great crisis that I would much rather see avoided. But it seems to me, therefore, that it is entirely reasonable to ask the government to disclose these documents, both so that the House can understand the risks involved and indeed that these can be in due course communicated more widely to the public. And of course, if the document suggests there are no risks involved, then that too is in need of communication. I give way.
The right honourable and learned gentleman for giving way, and there are few in this House who have his knowledge of the conventions and protocols of the House, excepting perhaps Mr. Speaker. And certainly my constituents do not follow the differences between prorogation, recess, Queen's Speech requirements, etc. But they do know that my title is Member of Parliament, and that implies where I should be in Parliament. And does the honourable member agree that at this time, this constitutional crisis, my constituents expect us to be sitting in Parliament, that Parliament is not shut down, and so that this question of why we are being prorogued goes to the credibility of me as a Member of Parliament, of this House in its entirety, and for that reason the public interest is absolutely involved.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly. And I do worry that this prorogation is, to my mind, a most regrettable event, because it does and is going to prevent this House from giving the proper scrutiny over what is, as I say, an evolving situation which has a critical importance to the future of our country. Of course, I give way to my right honourable friend.
I don't know if the right honourable gentleman has had a chance to look at the... Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The transcript of the evidence that I gave to the European Union Select Committee last week. In that evidence, I gave some undertakings about publications related to Yellowhammer. I just wanted to ask if those assurances, if carried out, would be sufficient for the right honourable gentleman.
I would rather hope that the assurances and the terms of this motion would prove to be entirely identical. I can see no reason why not, and such as the documents that have been revealed so far don't suggest to me that there's any material in it which touches upon essential issues of national security. It is entirely about the day-to-day life of this country in the immediate aftermath of departure. Of course, if there were national security implications, I'm sure that the right honourable gentleman, my right honourable friend, would be able to raise those and they could be dealt with.
Before this debate concludes, I hope that my right honourable friend will have the opportunity to look at the evidence submitted. submitted to the Exiting the European Union Select Committee, and I hope that on that basis he'll be able to take those assurances as appropriate. I'd be very grateful for his indication that he would do so.
If I may say to my right honourable friend, I think not. I think the terms of the motion cannot be abandoned unless the House wishes to abandon them. I cannot believe that the terms of the motion, on the basis of what he so graciously said to the House a moment ago, are going to be significantly dissimilar. So in those circumstances, I would very much hope that we will get the documentation relating to Yellowhammer in the way in which it was presented to him and his colleagues, and on which they are taking the decisions they are of great importance to the future of our country, its well-being, and the well-being of every citizen. Yes, I give way.
On the point of the Chair of the Duchy of Lancaster's evidence to the Select Committee last Thursday, I did indeed ask him whether he would publish Operation Yellowhammer, the report. And for the information of the House, this is what the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster said in response. What I hope to do is more than that. What I would like to do is to make sure that we have Yellowhammer once we have done the proper revision and the kicking of the tyres, alongside a publication that details the actions that the government has taken to inform people of the consequences and allows people to see the mitigations that have been put in place so that people can make a proper judgment about the changes that I need to make. Now, I think that is a full quotation. On that basis, it would seem to me that the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster would have no difficulty whatsoever with that part of my right honourable and learned friend's Standing Order 24 motion.
The right honourable gentleman is absolutely right. And if I may say, had this House more time, I would not have brought this part of the motion, because we could have waited sensibly to see. But the House will be gone by midnight tonight, or shortly thereafter, depending on how long our proceedings continue, and we're not going to be back till the 14th of October. And at that stage, indeed, because of the way in which the House starts a new session, the opportunities are not necessarily there in quite the same way, and the 14th of October is far too close to the 31st. I would suggest to the House for us to be able to accept that. And of course, if we don't vote for this motion in this form, we have no leverage over the government. Should, for example, my right honourable friend, the member for Surrey Heath, suddenly find that he is overridden by number 10 advisers and the Prime Minister, who decides that they want to delay a little bit and that these papers might come later on. And as I say, the great difficulty that we now have in this House, and I have to say I have, and I say it with great regret, is this terrible, compelling sense that trust is eroding. And that really brings me, Mr. Speaker, to my final remark. I do wish to conclude. I want this to... unless there's something very special, I would like to get this done. I give way.
To the right honourable gentleman, and before he concludes, he's had all sorts of emollient assurances from the Minister for the Cabinet Office, but the Daily Mail are just reporting right now, quote, Downing Street not in any mood to bow to Greaves' demands. Number 10 source, quote, under no circumstances will Number 10 staff comply with Greaves' demands regardless of any votes in Parliament. So perhaps if the Minister of the Cabinet Office would intervene on the right honourable gentleman again, he can press him to assure him that he won't see Parliament left and treated in contempt in such a way.
Well, I'm afraid this classically illustrates the problem that we now have. These extraordinary utterances, pronouncements from number 10 Downing Street that bear absolutely no relationship with the operation and conventions of our Constitution. And it's impossible to know whether they're froth, whether they're Mr. Cummings's thoughts, or whether in fact they represent some settled policy view of government, in which case this country is facing, frankly, a revolutionary situation, in which this House has to exercise the utmost vigilance to ensure that our rights and privileges are not simply trampled upon. And I would simply end with this. I'm very mindful of the fact, in this current crisis, that we're a divided country and we're a divided House. It pains me very much. I would like to try to work, even with those with whom I disagree, like some of my right honourable friends on the front bench, to try to get this matter resolved in a way which is compatible with also healing some of the divisions that we now have in our country. But this is simply not going to happen if the atmosphere of confrontation keeps on being ratcheted up, slowly undermining the institutions which are the only props of legitimacy. That's the truth for all of us, and in which everybody is happy to go into greenhouses and chuck bricks around all over the place and expect the structure to provide some shelter afterwards. Yes, I do give way to my right honourable learned friend.
I wonder whether, I've been listening with great care to my right honourable friend and learned friend's observations, and part of his drafted humble address troubles me. What legal right does the government have to require its employees to give up private email accounts and personal mobiles? And if there is no legal right, which I imagine he would contend there isn't, how on earth will the government enforce the humble address if it desired to do so?
Don't agree. These are government employees. And in the course of their work, it is their duty to observe the Civil Service Code and to comply with its requirements, including, I would respectfully suggest to my right honourable friend, the Attorney General, not using private means of communication to carry out official business. Now, and beyond that, if I may say, I'll give way to my friend. I'll give way to my right friend in a moment. And in addition to that, it is a question about what this House requests. Now, of course, I'm perfectly aware that sometimes I may say that the government may be acting abusively, so I'm the first to understand that there's a capacity for this House to act abusively. But what is being asked for, and ought to be respected by any self-respecting government employee, is that if you are asked to look and see whether you have carried out a communication or within the relevant request, which goes to your official work, you ought to be willing to provide it. It shouldn't be a question of coercion, it should be a question of willingness. And actually, if we move away from that, that is the destruction of another convention under which this country has been run, and it will be greatly to our detriment.
Yes, I know, but the point of order trumps the attempted intervention even of an illustrious law officer. Even. Point of order, Mr. Kevin Brennan.
Mr. Speaker, is it a point of order or a point of information to point out that the Prime Minister's Special Advisor Dominic Cummings asked to examine the private text messages on the telephone of a government employee?
The honourable gentleman has made his own point in his own way, and he may wish to expatiate further on that matter if he catches my eye in the course of the debate. Meanwhile, it's on the record and will be widely observed. And Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Well, my right honourable friend, the Attorney General.
My right honourable friend has just refined the humble address to confine the request for personal mobile information and personal private accounts only to communications which ought to have been carried out as official business on official accounts. That is the difficulty with the humble address. I'd invite him to consider that it is a blunt instrument, and in truth what this humble address requires is careful refinement so that it complies with legal rules. And what the binding, say, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, that this humble address has no binding legal effect on individuals. It has a binding potentially effect on the government if it observes it, but not on individuals. And the humble address, it seems to me, has a risk that it will trespass upon fundamental rights of individuals. as it's currently drafted, as refined.
They're doing their job. You're public officials.
I'm afraid I have to disagree politely with my right honourable and learned friend, the Attorney General. The issue is clearly defined. It relates to the prorogation of Parliament. That is what it concerns. And if I may say so, picking up the earlier point he made, I was just a little bit surprised. Because of course he may argue the government cannot get this information, but what number 10 Downing Street is saying is it won't even seek to provide it or try to provide it. And this again is absolutely illustrative of the slide we are experiencing at the moment towards a government that will not respect the conventions without which orderly government in this country cannot take place. Mr. Speaker, no, I want to finish. Mr. Speaker, for all those reasons, I believe that whilst I'm the first to recognise that any attempt at a motion of this kind will have a degree of bluntness which is unavoidable, it is in the... No, I want to finish. I give way to if my right honourable friend has a serious point, which you're always going to be serious, I give way to.
I thank my right honourable and learned friend. I'm very worried because I've been looking at the Special Advisor's Code of Conduct, and it says special advisors should not disclose official information which has been communicated in confidence in government or received in confidence from others. Does he not realise that his motion today actually sets all special advisors in conflict with the code that they have signed up to?
Not at all. Absolutely not at all. They are entitled to say correctly, I have been asked by the House of Commons in a motion under a humble address to Her Majesty the Queen to provide that information, and they should do so, if I may say so, with a public spirit and indeed a degree of pride. That's what I would do, because the request has been made of them. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to detain the House any further. As I said, I am the first to accept that this is a difficult matter, and I'm the first to accept that finding a uniquely, perfectly tailored instrument to meet the gravity of the situation that I think has arisen will always be difficult and might always be open to some reasonable criticism. But for all those things, I think the nature of what has happened and the immediacy of the crisis and the fact we are proroguing requires this motion, and I commend it to the House.
Thank you. The question is the motion as on the paper. Sir Keir Starmer?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And may I first just associate myself with the very many comments about your role as Speaker in this House and how you've performed it, certainly since I've been here. I didn't have the chance earlier, but I would want to associate myself with those comments. Mr. Speaker, I rise to support this application in the name of the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield. At the heart of this application is a simple principle, that the Executive should be honest and open with Parliament so as to enable this House properly to scrutinise the government's policies and decision. That should be a given, but it's not. And I'm afraid that speaks volumes. What underpins this application are two very important decisions. First, to prorogue this House for 5 weeks at what should be the most important and intensive part of the Brexit negotiations. And secondly, to deny the House the assessment of the preparations for a no-deal Brexit, the Yellowhammer analysis. I will.
Would he agree with me that, at the very least, members of this House should be aware of the costs of a no-deal Brexit, that this information is crucial to understanding whether it's between 2 billion or 8 billion, the cost of a no-deal Brexit?
I do agree with that. Mr. Speaker, it's regrettable that we're compelled to use this process and the humble address, but the reason is obvious. And today's measure speaks to a very wide truth. It's been touched on a number of times by the Right Honourable Learned Member for Beaconsfield. And I'm sad to say it's this, the basic lack of trust that now exists between this House and the Executive. And that has changed in recent weeks. And that lack of trust arises very much from the actions of the Prime Minister over the last weeks, which have contributed hugely to it. And that alone should be a profound cause of concern to all members of this House, because this House operates, in my experience, only 4 years plus, on the basis of trust. And that trust is going day by day, and that is why this application has had to be made. And that is a concern to all of us and should be a concern to the Secretary of State. Let me take the two issues one by one. Mr. Speaker, at this stage of the Brexit process, the House should be sitting as often as possible. Yes. Frankly, we should be sitting every day until the 31st of October. Instead, we've got a 5-week prorogation. The Prime Minister and ministers say it's to allow for a Queen's speech and a new legislative agenda. If anybody believes that, they'll believe anything. And since the Secretary of State's likely to try to make that case, I say try because I don't think he'll succeed, I have two questions. Why now? Why prorogue now at such a crucial time? What's wrong with November, when we know the outcome of the negotiations and have a decision? So why now, and why 5 weeks? There's no requirement for Parliament to be prorogued for 5 weeks. I will give way.
I thank him for giving way. He may be interested to know that in previous years I've asked the House Commons Library to provide me a list of what is going to be contained in the Government's Queen's speech in advance of it. This year again I have asked that question, and the House Commons Library have replied saying they're not able to provide me with any information about what might be in it because they haven't detected the Government announcing anything in relation to what's going to be in the Queen's speech.
Well, that intervention very much speaks for itself. I do remind the House that in the last 40 years, Parliament has never been prorogued for longer than 3 weeks. So this is extraordinary. That comes now and comes for 5 weeks. And in most cases, it's prorogued for the purposes of Queen's speech for only a week or less, and often just for a few days. So to shut down Parliament for so long a period at this stage of the Brexit process is extraordinary. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way, and I'm thoroughly supportive of this emergency debate and what it seeks to achieve. I think many people perhaps do not even realise that this isn't just closing down debate on Brexit, it's closing down debate on everything. So, for example, had we not been prorogued tomorrow, we would have had Treasury questions, and I would have asked a question to represent some of those people affected by the 2019 loan charge issue. All of those issues, the NHS, schools, everything now gets set on one side, and this House's voice is utterly muzzled on behalf of the people.
Well, I accept that intervention because the House is being shut down and we will not be able to do our job. And it's not just the closing down of members of Parliament. It's not us that's being shut out, it's those that we represent. The people are being shut out when you shut down Parliament, whether it's on the issues that have been mentioned or any other issues. And it's all very well for the government to say, well, we will produce some documents in relation to our analysis of a no-deal Brexit. When are we going to scrutinise them in the next 5 weeks? Because we're not going to be here. So even if the government did publish something, when do we get then to ask questions of the government? Not until it's far too late, and we're 2 weeks from the decision. So to simply say we'll publish some documents under Yellowhammer or anything else misses the point, which is there can be no scrutiny if we're not sitting. There's a wider observation I have to make, which if the purpose of proroguing is justified on the need to pass a Queen's speech, how on earth does the government think it can now achieve that? It reminds him the government's now got a majority of minus 40, and with cabinet ministers and even the Prime Minister's family resigning the Tory whip every day, can only wonder what the number will be by the time this House returns. So surely the government should now just give up on the idea of a Queen's speech and drop prorogation altogether. I will give way.
Is he aware of a recording of the Defence Secretary in which he states his view why a prorogation has really happened, and it is somewhat different to what the Prime Minister has put forward?
Well, I've seen that, but I go back. It's blindingly obvious why we're being closed down. And as I said earlier, if anybody believes it's genuinely for the orderliness of the House, the convenience of a Queen's speech, they'll believe anything. We're being closed down to stop scrutiny and an attempt to prevent this House expressing a view on no deal. The only positive from this, Mr. Speaker, is it actually galvanised the House last week to take the necessary action to prevent no deal, and actually pulled together the opposition and cross-party members who spoke very strongly with the bill that's just got royal assent. I will give way.
To my right honourable friend, I'm still mystified, Mr. Speaker, as to why the Prime Minister on the 14th of August agreed to go to the liaison committee this Wednesday if he knew already he was going to prorogue the House this Monday to avoid scrutiny.
Just again.
Well, it's a question I'm sure, if we were sitting, that's a question he could answer, not me, because we could ask him why he said that. But of course we won't be sitting, there won't be any questions, there won't be any scrutiny, that committee will not sit at the very point when we need maximum scrutiny. I will give way.
The honourable and learned gentleman for giving way. He drew attention a moment or two ago to the difficulty of passing a Queen's speech with a government majority of -43. In such circumstances, isn't the constitutionally proper thing to do to have a general election to settle the matter? And will he therefore be voting for one, as his leader promised last Wednesday, later on this evening?
I'm sure we'll have a general election soon, but not at the cost of a no-deal Brexit, which will so damage this country. Mr. Speaker, the second issue addressed in this motion is the Yellowhammer documents. I wrote to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster on the 25th of August, a fortnight ago now, calling for the publication of these documents when Parliament returned after the summer recess. I haven't yet got a reply. Instead of publication, we've had an update with no supporting documents and no significant new information. I will.
Thank my honourable and learned friend for giving way. Now, the Yellowhammer report has been shared with the Welsh Government on a strictly confidential basis and is subject to the Official Secrets Act. Does my right honourable and learned friend agree with me? This is indeed an affront to the people of Wales not to tell them what is in that report.
I understand that the people of Wales need that information, this House needs that information, and frankly, to take the country on a route that may well end up with a no-deal Brexit, but without providing the analysis of the impact of that, is wrong, so wrong in principle that we shouldn't be where we are today. With no documents and analysis to look at, and being shut down tonight, so that even if some documents are produced, we can't properly scrutinise them. All we can rely on are leaks to the Sunday papers, which show, if the leaks are right, that under the most likely scenario, the government does expect to see a return of a hard border in Northern Ireland, notwithstanding the efforts of many people to ensure that doesn't happen, that will disrupt fuel supply, will lead to disruption at UK ports, will introduce severe delays in medical supplies and cause significant disruption and impediments to the ordinary functioning of British citizens' lives and businesses. I'll give way both times, but I'll give way first.
Thank you to the honourable gentleman for giving way. As he knows, the British government are planning a £100 million propaganda campaign to sell the virtues of no deal. Couldn't they save a lot of money to the taxpayer by agreeing to the terms of the motion, which will see these documents published on Wednesday?
They could save a lot of money by coming here and putting the information in the public domain without the money attached. We could have had these documents last week. We could have the irony of a public information campaign when the impact assessments are not being made available to Parliament. And millions of pounds being spent telling the country to get ready, but without having the decency to put the documents before Parliament and allowing Parliament to sit so they can be scrutinised. I did say I'll give way, and then I'll give way in a minute.
I thank the right honourable and learned gentleman for giving way. Does he agree with me that it is reprehensible that this government has put us in the position and put the people of the United Kingdom in the position that we are having to fight every step of the way through the courts, through Parliament, just to get the very basic information about the impact of a no-deal Brexit, and that is information that should have been given to the people well ahead of the referendum. And now we're in a position to have brinkmanship and kamikaze-like behaviour from individuals who are going to damage the lives of our constituents like mine, who will not be able to get medical supplies. And he mentioned Yellowhammer Medical Supplies. A close member of my family and a number of my constituents suffer from ulcerative colitis and are concerned about medical supplies and are concerned about their health. And it is a disease that is exacerbated by stress. This government is putting the lives and the health of our citizens under threat. Does he agree?
I agree. And it goes to this basic question of transparency. If the government wants to take us down this path that may end up with a no-deal Brexit, they should have the decency and the courage to put the analysis before Parliament so we can see what it is. I did say I would give way.
And learned friend for giving way. Does he agree with me that the difference between the 100 million that the government is spending on so-called information and the information that we are seeking the publication of using this emergency debate is the difference between gross propaganda paid for by the taxpayer and factual information which ought to be in the public domain as we approach the 31st of October?
Well, I agree. The government is telling us to get ready, but it won't tell us what to get ready for. I say that really just to underline that these are not trivial documents. These are critically important documents, and they ought to be put before Parliament. I will give way.
I may be missing something here, but if his party votes for an early election tonight, then this will then be decided on the 15th of October, and he and his right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, if they have the confidence of the people, can then go and stop no deal and give the necessary notice. So why on earth are they balking at the opportunity to get this settled properly by the people of the country?
That's such an unconvincing answer to the question of whether there should be basic transparency and accountability in this House. It's unconvincing. I'll give way.
To the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and I congratulate him on really stressing the fact that this is not just a technical debate. What's at stake here is literally the livelihoods and lives of our constituents. And on that subject, does he share my concern that my freedom of information request to DEFRA was turned down when I was trying to ask about the impacts of food supplies and risks from a no-deal Brexit? DEFRA confirmed they had that information about what the impacts on food supplies would be, but apparently it wouldn't be in the public interest to reveal it. Does he share my concern about that?
I am concerned about that, and I recall that that's where we started the journey last time when we were asking for impact assessment because freedom of information requests were made but not fulfilled. I do give way.
Gentleman for giving way. Australia is currently suffering from an appalling flu outbreak which is worse than any they have seen in many years. Now, the vaccine for under 65s is more complex this year and will not be in place before the 31st of October. Does he agree with me that if we have a worse epidemic than 2017 and do not have the vaccines, which have to be kept chilled, we could grind the NHS services right across the UK to a halt this year? And if we don't have the details from Yellowhammer, how can anybody be prepared?
I'm grateful for that intervention on a very serious issue, and it makes the wider point that is that very many members of the public are extremely concerned about a no-deal Brexit in relation to the impact on their lives, which is why this application is the right application to be made. It's made because Parliament is being shut down. Preparations for no deal are not being scrutinised. I commend the motion to the House and urge members on all sides to support it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The Honourable Lady was not seeking to intervene, but to orate. Am I right? I am right. Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to speak briefly, as I was not given a chance to make my intervention to the right honourable gentleman opposite. I wish to focus on two very brief points. The honourable gentleman that I follow mentioned the issue of irony. There is an irony, Mr. Speaker, at the heart of this debate. Every member on the opposite side that has stood up and warned about the risks of a no-deal Brexit had the opportunity to vote for a deal 3 times in this House, Mr. Speaker. And to my knowledge, I have not heard a single one of those, including from the front bench, give any kind of convincing argument as to why they did not vote for the deal negotiated by the former Prime Minister, except for the fact that it was negotiated by a Conservative. No, I'm afraid I will not give way, because there are a number of speakers who want to speak on this matter. The irony is staring us all in the face. We all want to honour our constituents' desire to leave the European Union expressed in that historic referendum. At least that's certainly what I was put into this House to do, Mr. Speaker. I was put in here to honour that mandate expressed at the ballot box. It wasn't a vote that I made, but I understand that it is my duty to carry out their wishes, not to think I know better than them. They are people. They only had one vote. And it is my intention to fight and to honour that. So that is what I am putting here to do. And my constituents are watching this with astonishment and frustration. The more we go round and round in circles with these processes that make absolutely no sense to people outside of this place, the more angry and frustrated they are, because all they can see is a House of Commons that's completely out of touch with people outside of there. And, Mr. Speaker, that is the point that I wish to make, and I'm proud to make it on behalf of my constituents in Redditch, who communicate with me on a regular basis. The second point I wish to make, Mr. Speaker, is about trust. Again, we are speaking about trust, and trust is at the heart of this argument, because the trust that people put in us as representatives of their will when they placed their vote in that referendum was that we would honour it. And all that they have seen from us in here is people trying not to honour it. I have not seen a single member on the other side putting down motions, or even on our benches, unfortunately, because this is an issue that obviously cuts across political colours. As I have said many times in this House before, of course it does. It's obvious to all of us. But what's happening here, these shenanigans and these motions, are put down by people who actually want to stop this democratic process from happening. They want to stop Brexit from happening. They're not honest enough to admit it. If they were so sure of their argument...
Anna Soubry.
Mr. Speaker, two things said by the honourable lady. One, that people were thwarting democracy, and second, that honourable and right honourable members were not being honest in the arguments they advanced. Presumably, she's referring to the right honourable learned member who sits some 3 benches behind her.
I hope the right honourable lady will forgive me. There's no point in me pretending otherwise. I was immersed, as the chair sometimes is, in a kind of Socratic dialogue at the chair with an honourable gentleman. Therefore, I did not hear what the honourable lady said. I find it hard to credit that she would impute dishonour to a colleague, and in particular to a colleague on her own benches, and certainly she shouldn't do so. So I have at this stage to declare her innocent, because there is no evidence of the guilt. But nevertheless, it is useful to be reminded of the dictate of Erskine May that moderation and good humour in the use of parliamentary language are reliable watchwords in conducting our debates. Rachel Maclean.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your guidance, and I endeavour to follow it, and should my words have been misinterpreted, I of course withdraw them immediately. I made the point that there are divisions on this issue on our benches, And the people that are trying to bring forward these processes are the people who are trying to stop Brexit, and actually some of them are quite honest about that, and they've been open about that, and that's fine. That is their policy. The opposition party are now a party of Remain, and that is fine. It would be clearer if they would put that to the test in a general election, and let's see the public's verdict on it. But they're too frightened to do that, unfortunately. My final point, Mr. Speaker, on the substance of the... I will give way, of course.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and I understand the passion with which she speaks. Will she accept that there are many of us who are supporting this motion, and have supported other such motions in the whole endeavour, who have, like her, voted 3 times for a withdrawal agreement, wish to see a withdrawal agreement, and have assured the Prime Minister in this House and outside it that I will personally vote for any agreement that he brings back from the EU Council?
I thank my honourable friend very much, and of course I'm delighted to hear that, and I absolutely acknowledge his support for the withdrawal agreement and for any future deals that can be brought back, and it's wonderful to hear that. So my final point, Mr. Speaker, is just on the role of the special advisers who of course have been caught up in this humble address that's before us today. I don't have a lot of experience of special advisers. I'm a junior PPS, and I've had the privilege of working with a few special advisers in the departments that I have been honoured to assist with. And I found them all, without exception, Mr. Speaker, to be dedicated and conscientious individuals doing their job to the best of their ability. Is it on this point?
Very, very grateful indeed to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and she speaks about experience of special advisers. How many special advisers has you worked with that have been found in contempt of Parliament?
Well, I think that, Mr. Speaker, this is a hypothetical point because we have not yet passed this motion. And as I've said before when I started my remarks, I have not been here very long and I have very limited experience, so of course none. However, we are looking here at an unprecedented situation for those individuals who came into public life and into politics for the best of reasons. They were motivated because they wanted to perform public service and carry out their offices. And I think that this humble address puts them in an extremely difficult position. And I do note, Mr. Speaker, that there are governments of all colours who have special advisers. It's an established role. It's not just this government that's had special advisers. The Labour Party had special advisers as well. And I think we need to be extremely careful about how we try to tie their hands and constrain the freedom that they have to advise those ministers that they work with. Because I do think we are...
Doughty. I must raise, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure the Honourable Lady didn't want to mislead the House unintentionally, but what she said was that it was hypothetical that the Special Advisor, Mr Dominic Cummings, had been found in contempt of Parliament. That is not hypothetical, Mr. Speaker, it's a fact.
Yes, there isn't an unpurged contempt. There isn't an unpurged contempt, and my recollection of the particular case, with the details of which I'm broadly familiar, is that he was not invited to apologise. He was not invited to apologise. But there was a contempt, and that is a matter of unarguable and incontrovertible fact. These matters came my way recently in circumstances with which I need not trouble the House, but I do know of what I speak. There was a contempt. Rachel McLean.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Speaker. The question I was asked in the other intervention was how many have I worked with, and I haven't worked with Dominic Cummings. So I was answering the question in a quite straightforward way, Mr. Speaker. But I have made my point. I will bring my remarks to a close. I will not be supporting the humble address for the reasons that I've laid out, and I think the House would do well not to support it.
Hear, hear. Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to state the Scottish National Party's unequivocal support for this application and to congratulate the Right Honourable and learned member for Beaconsfield in achieving this debate. Mr Speaker, unlike the previous speaker, unlike the honourable lady who spoke previously, I'm going to confine myself to the terms of the motion. But I would just gently wish to remind her that this motion is supported from members across the House, some of whom, like her, have constituencies who voted leave, and some of whom, like me, have constituencies which voted remain. And when we talk of the will of the people in Scotland, the will of the people in Scotland is to remain. And so I have no shame in having that as my primary motivation. But having said that, I'm also very concerned that this Parliament and this government, for so long as I and my colleagues are here, that things are done properly. And there's very strong grounds for suspicion that things have not been done properly in relation to this prorogation. Because, Mr Speaker, the dogs in the street know that the reason this Prime Minister is proroguing Parliament is to avoid scrutiny as he hurtles towards the 31st of October and a no-deal Brexit. And really, nobody is fooled that the prorogation has anything to do with the need to commence a new session and to have a Queen's speech on pressing domestic bills, which none of us have seen so far. And if the litigation in which I and others in this House are involved in Scotland has achieved nothing else, it will have shown that something is very much awry with the reasons given for the prorogation. Because as I'll give way to the honourable lady.
I agree with what she says, and in so many ways I think were we able to have a voice on this, many members of this House would think we shouldn't even have conference recess for 3 weeks, and actually Parliament should be here doing its job at a time of crisis, speaking on behalf of our communities.
I entirely agree with the honourable lady on that matter. But, Mr Speaker, the documents lodged with the Scottish Court last week and revealed to the public against the government's wishes, but as a result of interventions by the legal team which I and others in this House instruct, and by the BBC and other newspapers, they reveal that the Prime Minister had approved a plan to prorogue Parliament on the 16th of August. Yet, as the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman said in his opening speech, as late as the 25th of August, a Number 10 spokesperson was still denying that there was any such plan to prorogue. And indeed, in the pleadings lodged by the government in response to the action raised in Scotland by myself and other members of this House, the British government referred to our contention that we were in fear of a prorogation as hypothetical and academic. So there are very real reasons to believe that this government is economical with the truth. Yep. And the memos produced by the British government not only showed the somewhat distasteful comment about girly swats, with which I think the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman dealt with most ably earlier, but they also showed that the reason that the current Prime Minister wants to prorogue this Parliament is because he wants to avoid what he referred to as the rigmarole of this Parliament sitting in September. So if the Scottish case achieves nothing else, it has shown that the government hasn't been entirely truthful so far. And another myth that was finally put to rest at the weekend occurred when the Right Honourable Member for Hastings and Rye resigned, because most of us were not surprised to hear her confirm that there are in fact no negotiations ongoing at present with the European Union. Now, of course, we already knew that from the former Chancellor of the Exchequer and also from a number of counterparts in the European Union. And I noted last week at the Brexit Select Committee, the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster initially tried to give the impression that negotiations were ongoing, but when pressed on the matter, he conceded that there are no negotiations as such, merely discussions. So we heard that from the Chancellor for the Duchy of Lancaster last week, but it was good, Mr Speaker, to hear it from someone who has so recently been at the heart of government and has had the decency to leave the government, given what she's seen. And, Mr Speaker, the weight of evidence regarding the damage that no deal would do to the nations of these islands is overwhelming, and we all know that from the work we've done in select committees over the last few years, work which won't be happening over the next few weeks. when Parliament is prorogued. But still, Mr Speaker, the Government won't tell us the truth about the assessment they've made of the impact of a no-deal Brexit and the preparations they're making for that. So it's quite right that this House seek the documentation relating to Operation Yellowhammer. But I want to concentrate on the prorogation case, because myself and a number of other MPs and peers and Joe Mon QC and the Good Law Project have raised an action in Scotland in which we argue that Parliament is being prorogued for an unlawful purpose and to prevent democratic scrutiny, and that therefore the court should overturn the order to prorogue. And although the judge at first instance wasn't with us, we had a full hearing before Scotland's appeal court last week, and we're awaiting the outcome of that decision on Wednesday of this week. And of course, there's also been a date on the 17th of September assigned at the UK Supreme Court to hear any further appeal in the Scottish case, and also an appeal in the proceedings raised in England and Northern Ireland. And members of the public should be aware that if the courts eventually find out that the prorogation was unlawful, then they can order this Parliament to return. So even if we are prorogued tonight, all is not lost. But in the course of these proceedings, something rather curious happened last week. And I would commend to honourable members' attention a very interesting article written about this in the Financial Times at the weekend by David Allen Green, the distinguished legal commentator, entitled "The Curious Incident of the Missing Witness Statement." Because, Mr Speaker, in the Scottish case, the petitioners argue that the government had an improper motive in seeking the prorogation, and we say that the real intention was a cynical effort to close down Parliament so it couldn't block a no-deal Brexit. And usually there's a pretty straightforward way for the government or the responding party to rebut or refute an allegation of such bad faith. And if you're facing an allegation of bad faith like that, the normal thing to do in an action of judicial review would be to submit a sworn statement, an affidavit, setting out the way in which the decision was made, setting out that the decision was properly taken, and lodging relevant supportive documentation. But what happened last week in Edinburgh was that the government didn't provide any such witness statement, no such sworn affidavit, no official explanation, simply some documents heavily redacted without any covering explanation. And, Mr Speaker, the absence of such a statement in litigation such as this is, as David Allen Green says, very conspicuous.
Would she give way on that?
Yes, I will.
I'm very grateful for her giving way, and I'm certainly not a lawyer, but from general knowledge, is what the government is doing here effectively the equivalent in American terms of taking the fifth, i.e. refusing to give evidence on the basis that it might incriminate them or cause them to commit perjury?
It does rather have the whiff of that. And at Prime Minister's questions last week, the Right Honourable and Learned Member for Beaconsfield asked the Prime Minister, as he said earlier, why it's proved impossible in the course of the Scottish legal proceedings to find any official of government or minister prepared to state on oath in a sworn statement the reasons for the prorogation. And as he said, the Prime Minister didn't answer the question. And as the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman went on to say, it has been suggested to a number of members of this House, myself included, by reliable sources, that officials of the government were approached by the government legal service to swear such statements and refused to do so. Now, Mr Speaker, I can't know the reasons why they refused to sign a sworn statement. I can only speculate. And I speculate that perhaps they refused to sign a sworn statement for fear of perjuring themselves, or for fear that to tell the truth would be damaging to the government. Now, the idea, Mr Speaker, that any government official should be put in a position where they fear having to perjure themselves before the courts of either the jurisdictions of Scotland, England, or any jurisdiction within this United Kingdom is very, very concerning. And the same sources that have suggested that officials have refused to sign sworn statements have also suggested to myself and other members of this House that what has been going on is that key figures in number 10 and the government have been communicating about the real reasons for prorogation, not through the official channels of government emails or government memos, but using personal emails, WhatsApp, and burner phones, which of course are phones that are normally used by people who are involved in a criminal enterprise in order to avoid being traced. Now, if this is true, they will have adopted a subterfuge. And there can really only be one reason for that subterfuge, and that would be to conceal the real reasons for prorogation from the scrutiny of this House, and also very seriously from the scrutiny of the courts. Now, the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman who presented this motion explained at some length what careful thought he's given to the way in which it's been presented, and so I'm not going to repeat any of that, other than to say that he has clearly applied his mind very carefully to it, and the allegations that underlie this motion are very, very serious. If there is no truth in them, then so be it. But let us pass the motion and let there be transparency and accountability, because transparency and accountability are, I suggest, Mr. Speaker, the two things which this Prime Minister and his shabby administration fear the most.
Would she give way?
I will give way, yes.
She's making a very powerful case, and I just wondered if she would agree that the cavalier treatment by this government of parliamentary procedure and democratic principle really does underline the need not just for uncodified practices, but for a written constitution, and in particular for a citizens' assembly that could actually put the people at the heart of our democracy again.
Well, yes, I agree with my honourable friend, and I also take it further. The shabby practices of this government and the creaking of the British Constitution underline, in my mind, the need for my country to be independent of this mess. But, Mr. Speaker, even as we've been speaking this afternoon, it's been reported on Twitter, as another honourable member alluded to, that number 10 sources, unidentified number 10 sources, are saying that even if we pass this humble address tonight, they're not going to comply with it. And,
I'm extremely grateful to the Honourable and Learned Lady. Can I just very gently point out to her that as there is a significant number of other members waiting to contribute, and as the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Chancellor of Duchy, has got every right and reasonable expectation to think that he will have 10 minutes or so to speak, I'm cautiously optimistic that the Honourable and Learned Lady is approaching her peroration. Joanna Cherry.
Mr. Speaker, you're correct. I'm drawing to a close, and I was just going to say in relation to those unattributable briefings this afternoon. I'm more of a student of Scottish history than of English history, Mr. Speaker, but our histories are bound together. And I know enough about English history to know that it was secret, unaccountable whispers of poison that brought down Edward II and Richard II. And I suspect this Prime Minister will be brought down by secret, unaccountable whispers of poison, such as that was briefed this afternoon as well. So let's make sure that this House and the courts see the contents of the secret whispers of poison that preceded this prorogation, so that we can all see the real reasons this House of Commons has been prorogued by an executive terrified of scrutiny.
Now, a self-denying ordinance would help. I think the Right Honourable Gentleman can probably deliver himself of his thoughts on this matter within 5 minutes. Mr. Owen Patterson.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I will be extremely brief because I had come to this debate with no intention of speaking. But I would just like to make the point that the Right Honourable Lady who's just spoken to Scott Nats, talking about poison, and secrets and poison, we're naming 9 individuals here, and some of whom have never worked for the government before, some of whom have only been working as special advisers for a week or 10 days. And this whole debate, bluntly, offends my sense of fairness. We have a long tradition of innocent and proven guilty. And spokesman of Scott Nats, Right Honourable Lady, Learned Lady, assumes instant guilt on the part of these people. Now, we all know there are probably two names here who she would love to flush out. But there are other individuals here, and I do think members should just think these are junior people. They've not worked for the government very long. No, I won't give way. There are significant figures who could have been chosen. The Cabinet Secretary, learned counsel who advises the government, the Treasury Council, people like that, who might advise the government. We got a very unsatisfactory, or I got a very unsatisfactory answer to the question as to the criteria which my right honourable learned friend put down to naming these people. And I just think, before this witch hunt atmosphere continues, would members opposite like to consider they are talking about 9 relatively junior members assisting the government? There are 2 names we know who they would very much like to flush out. But can we just think of the impact on them that their private emails, their private phone to their family and friends are all going to be inspected? And who is the omniscient person, this great fount of wisdom, who will judge whether those messages are pertinent to this motion? And I would just like members, before they vote for this motion tonight, to just consider, who is that person going to be? Who is going to be the chairman of the Committee of Public Safety, who is actually going to make those decisions? And are they also prepared to put their private communications on the record? The shadow spokesman, I'm sure, has had many, many communications, right honourable learned gentlemen, with senior members of the European Commission. Mr. Guy Verhofstadt, only this afternoon, has given a great paean of praise to you, Mr. Speaker, has welcomed you. He's going to welcome you to the European Parliament. I very much doubt you, Mr. Speaker, are going to make available to us your private communications with Mr. Guy Verhofstadt. So, you asked me to be brief, and I will be very brief. Could we please just recognise that this particular motion is invidious, in my opinion, and unfair, and chooses 9 names arbitrarily, whereas I would consider if people were really on a fishing expedition, they could have gone wider and gone for more senior figures, and of course the one they're really after is the Prime Minister, and he does come to this House, and there will be many opportunities. There will be many opportunities to ask him the questions, because he is ultimately the one they should be after. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Has the right honourable gentleman finished his oration?
Mr. Speaker.
We're deeply obliged to the honourable gentleman, and I think we now need very short speeches. 4 minutes, perhaps. Don't break.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will certainly do it within your 4-minute limit. First of all, I would just like to focus on Operation Yellowhammer. So the issue about prorogation is whether the government deliberately misled Parliament. The issue in relation to Operation Yellowhammer is whether the government are deliberately withholding key documents from Parliament and from the public. Now, members of Parliament will have seen the report last month in the Sunday Times when they published the leak of Operation Yellowhammer and said that Britain would face shortages of fuel, food and medicine and 3 months of chaos at its ports in the event of a no-deal exit, and went on to warn that lorries might face delays of 2.5 days at ports and medical supplies might be vulnerable to severe extended delays, and it also said the government had expected a return of a hard border in Ireland. And of course, we haven't been able to see these documents because the government haven't been willing to provide them to us. But what we have had is a series of ministers touring studios saying, in effect, nothing to see in this document, nothing to worry about, everything is under control. But of course, at the same time, we see reports that, I'm afraid, the minister who is on the front bench is seeking to sanitise said report, and then having failed apparently to sanitise it, he has simply decided to rely on the fact that the report isn't going to be published at all. And I have sought assurances from the government that, for instance, civil servants who were, if they were asked to modify this document, in effect to sanitise it, would be in breach of the ministerial code. I've also asked whether they were going to be subject to disciplinary action if they refused to sanitise it, and finally whether if they spoke out because they noticed that the document had been sanitised, whether they would be covered by whistleblower legislation. And when I asked for this information, I was referred to the evidence that the Minister gave to the Select Committee, or was about to give to the Select Committee last week. And, of course, as members would expect me to do, I went hot foot then after he'd given evidence to see whether, in fact, he had answered any of these questions, and, of course, he hadn't. So maybe when he replies now, rather than sending me a letter referring me to evidence where he hasn't answered the question, perhaps he would like to answer those specific questions. Because we need to have this information available. Businesses are trying to prepare for no deal. The government are withholding information from them. At the same time, the minister in charge of local government is writing to local authorities telling them they have to provide information to residents and businesses about what preparation they are doing in relation to no deal. So it does seem as though if the government on the one hand are asking local authority leaders to make that information available, there is a duty on the government themselves to make that information available, yet what we have from the government is the withholding of this critical information that would allow all of us to prepare for a no-deal scenario. Now, it may be that the government are worried that perhaps simply putting this information into the public domain might lead to, for instance, shortages of food. And to some extent, I understand that. But if that is the case, this would be less than perfect. But again, it's something I've suggested to the Minister, that they might want to release the information on Privy Council terms to Privy Councillors and allow us to access that information. I would prefer, clearly, all members of Parliament to be able to see that information, but if that's one way perhaps the government felt more confident that the information could be shared, that they could do that. So I hope when we get a response from the Minister that he will be quite specific in answering these questions which so far have been avoided by government, because I think all of us would like to know the answer to those questions so that we have a degree of uncertainty about what the impact of no deal will be, so that we can all help businesses and others prepare for that eventuality.
I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman. Again, I do beg the honourable gentleman's pardon. Yes, I think he used to make those sorts of coughing noises when he was at Oxford with my wife 30 years ago. Yes, very good. 3 or 4 minutes. Simon Hall.
I think I can say this without peradventure, Mr. Speaker. They were happier days. I'm going to, Mr. Speaker, vote against this motion this evening. And I'm going to do so for, I think, the very clear reason that government must function. And if officials and advisers are to provide information to ministers, they should be able to do so freely and without any thought that their correspondence, whilst it's in an official capacity, will just be dragged before us. But I want to make a couple of important caveated points, if I may. My understanding is that our unwritten constitution, as crazy and as Byzantine as it often can be, can only work and can only continue to work where there is trust, where there are checks, and where there are balances, and that those three things are observed and maintained. We all hear the phrase "through the usual channels." We all know what that means. This place wouldn't function, our constitution wouldn't function, without the daily conversations between the principal parties in this place and others in how legislation is going to be delivered. I don't believe, whilst a number of honourable and right honourable members have referenced it, I don't believe that this motion matters whether one voted leave, remain or indeed abstained in the referendum campaign. It is about the functioning of government, and as a number of colleagues have already referenced, about trust. And it does matter that good practice and the rule of law are followed. I think people in this place and indeed in the country are broadly satisfied to accept a decision if and when they are confident that the means by which that decision has been arrived at is clear and fair, or what I would often call colloquially passing the sniff test. And it's been very interesting. I have had, as I'm sure we've all had, hundreds if not thousands of emails over the last months advocating position X, Y or Z with regards to leaving the European Union. But I've had no email from anybody, even those the most avowed and determined advocates of Brexit in my constituency, who have felt that proroguing Parliament has been the right thing to do. And I think hiding behind a narrative, well, we were going to rise for 3 weeks anyway for the conference recess, having had 6 weeks off already, the conference recess should not have been standing in the way or used as an argument to support the narrative of prorogation. The conference recess should not have been taking place, and the conferences should either have been cancelled or gone on in a lesser form. I don't think it passes the test, and I just think it is interesting. I have had no correspondence. Now, I probably regret saying this. I shall probably be inundated tonight and tomorrow, but I have had no constituent saying I think prorogation is the right thing to do. So I urge my honourable and right honourable friends on the Treasury bench just to consider those points and to think about the very important need, particularly, I think, taking onto ourselves the humility that we were certainly last week a minority administration. I've slightly lost track of the figures. But we haven't got the muscularity of numbers where we can deal lightly with constitutional norms and trying to deal with this place. I am concerned, as was flushed out at the UQ on Thursday, that the Secretary of State, my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, has still not received, as I understand, no other Cabinet Minister has received the legal advice from my right honourable and learned friend, the Attorney, with regards to prorogation. Now, we have had the legal advice of the Attorney published before. I understand that in normal times it is perfectly, and I'm not a lawyer, but it is perfectly proper for that to be lawyer-client privilege. But of course we all recall, Mr. Speaker, that we saw the legal advice of the Attorney with regards to the amendments that my right honourable friend, the then Prime Minister, the member for Maidenhead, had secured, and how it had affected the legal status of the withdrawal agreement. So there is a precedent here for the publication of legal advice. And I say, as somebody who is concerned to get leaving the European Union right on behalf of my constituents, but also as the chairman of the Northern Ireland Select Committee, I do think the legislative needs of Northern Ireland, particularly in the scenario of a no-deal exit, are being ridden roughshod over by the fact that the House is being prorogued this evening. And I do seek assurance from my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy, that the needs of Northern Ireland, in order to maintain what he and I hold to be incredibly precious, the unity of our United Kingdom, is not being dealt with in a cavalier fashion. As I say, I will be voting against this motion, but the front bench does need to think about how it deals with these matters.
Very well done. Thank you. Right, even shorter speeches, because the Chancellor must have his opportunity. A couple of minutes, I'm sure a great intellectual colossus like the Honourable Lady can express her thoughts in 2 minutes.
She's not standing.
The Honourable Lady is an intellectual giant. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I put my name to this motion for 3 very simple things. I agree with what many of the members across this House have said about what our constituents do not understand about what is going on in this place. Many of them do not understand the concept of prorogation. Indeed, one of my constituents thought it was something to do with pierogi and thought it was something about dumplings. They don't understand why, when this country is facing a massive crisis, MPs are upping sticks and going home. And when I tell them it is not of my choosing, they ask whose choosing was it.
This motion is about understanding that process. Indeed, as the member for North Dorset says, does it pass the Smith test? Because the honest truth is, everything we've seen to date says it simply doesn't. But more than that, my constituents don't really understand the machinations of official channels and the Civil Service Code, but they do get that there is a cabal of people who are unelected, who are making decisions about their future without any accountability. And I gently say to members opposite who are concerned about this concept of being able to look at the private emails that maybe they wish to Google and revisit some of the situations this House had to deal with in 2011 and indeed in 2013, and precisely the point about civil servants and special advisers using official channels to conduct official business. I'm sure there are members on the front bench who can tell them of that time and the clarity that was given that that information would be FOI-able. So this is not about something new, it's simply about the exigency of needing to see that information when we're making decisions. And finally, the third thing that my constituents would not really understand, because they don't know what no-deal Brexit entails. Nobody really does, because we haven't yet, thankfully, experienced it. But they do know that there are doctors going on the national airwaves telling them that the government is stockpiling body bags, and then they're hearing the Leader of the House discrediting that very same doctor. And there is a simple question at the heart of this motion, which is the question that all of our constituents, I suspect whether we have Leave or Remain constituencies, have been asking us over the last couple of weeks. What on earth is going on? And the honest truth, if we want to talk about truth in this place, is that none of us can really answer those questions, because this very information, the homework as to why prorogation has suddenly appeared, the homework as to what a no-deal Brexit would actually mean, whether it is true that 85% of lorries travelling across the Channel are not ready for French customs, or that the supply of fresh food will be disrupted, or whether the simple truth is that if it's not as far-fetched as the stories in the press, then actually just publishing Yellowhammer will set everybody's minds at rest. So this motion tonight is about us being able to do what we should be able to do best, inform our constituents and hold the government and their advisers to account. I urge everyone to support it.
Right, I'm afraid there needs to be a 2-minute limit. Mr. Ian Lucas.
This motion is about trust, and we should understand the people we're dealing with. As recently as July 2019, the Electoral Commission published detailed evidence upon which it based its finding that Vote Leave committed electoral offences in the immediate lead-up to the 2016 referendum. In March 2019, Vote Leave itself admitted breaking electoral law. Electoral law was there to safeguard democracy. Vote Leave's offences, set out in detail in the July 2019 Electoral Commission findings, explained that Vote Leave conspired to break the referendum spending limits quite deliberately by channeling money to the Canadian company AIQ through an alternative funding stream. Dominic Cummings, working for Vote Leave at the time, explained in evidence disclosed by the Electoral Commission thus: there is another organisation who can spend your money. Would you be willing to send 100k to some social media ninjas who could usefully spend it in the final crucial 5 days? Obviously, it would be entirely legal. As we now know from the Electoral Commission, accepted by Vote Leave, it was entirely illegal. Dominic Cummings, in his words, said that this spending was crucial. We know that the Secretary of State for the Cabinet Office knew of these payments. In an interview with Dominic Murnahan of Sky News, he said he knew of these illegal payments, but not until after the referendum had taken place. On the 5th of August this year, following his appointment to the position of being the Minister responsible for electoral reform, I wrote to the Secretary of State asking when he knew of these illegal payments, which I believe to be a matter of crucial public interest. He has not replied. Dominic Cummings has refused to give evidence to the DCMS Select Committee, frustrating its inquiry, and he's been found to be in contempt of Parliament. When he was appointed as the Prime Minister's advisor, I wrote to the Prime Minister asking him to instruct Dominic Cummings to give evidence to the Select Committee. The Prime Minister has refused to do this. These are the people who are making these decisions, and we cannot trust them to make the right decisions. I support the motion.
Oh, what an invidious choice. Dr. Rosanna Allen-Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is an absolute disgrace that tonight we go home for a number of weeks after we've already been off for many weeks already. This government are playing games, And while I am the MP for Tooting, I'm also a Tooting girl who is here voted to do her job. For the 5-year-old boy who is starving and has to go to the local food bank, he hasn't got time for games. For the mother who is waiting for her delayed cancer treatment, she hasn't got time for games. For the family who have been failed by the DWP and are starving and cannot pay their electricity bills and face another cold winter, they haven't got time for games. At a time when there has never been greater distrust between the public and us in here, we are letting them down. For the mother who has to bury her son in my patch, who knows that her other children have no opportunity, they don't have time for the games that we are playing in this house. For the people sitting in the gallery, we are a laughing stock, and leaving without a deal makes the very poorest, the most vulnerable in our communities, in our society, even worse off. So today I say, on behalf of Balham, Tooting, Fursdown and Earlsfield, this government is a disgrace.
Yes.
Proroguing Parliament is a disgrace. And I am here in my capacity as an MP and a regular, ordinary girl from Tooting who had never been in this place until she was elected to be here. We deserve better. Our communities deserve better. Let us be here to do our jobs.
Thank you. Mr. Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like many people, I've had many constituents over the weekend in Cardiff telling me that they have simply got totally confused about what is going on. They're not interested in the procedures and the chicanery. What they are interested in is their lives and what difference the proceedings in here make to them. So why does this matter? Why does this motion matter, and why am I supporting it? Well, the gag that the government is going to put on Parliament tonight prevents us from having Treasury questions, Northern Ireland questions, the Prime Minister being put there at the dispatch box to answer questions, DCMS questions, questions to the Attorney General, whose legal advice is so crucial to this, debates on the Battle of Arnhem, in which my grandfather served and was taken prisoner of war, the pension age of our police, sanctions, refugees, climate change, EU citizens, the Middle East, fracking, Northern Ireland, chemicals, sexual violence, children. It's going to prevent the discussion and agreement on the agriculture bill, the immigration bill, the trade bill, customs bill, wild animals and circuses bill, and crucially, the domestic violence bill. And yet this government has carried on with this gag, and they tell us it's because they want to set out a provision for a new Queen's Speech, a new programme for government. Who are they fooling? We know the truth. We know why this is done. The Prime Minister's own documents have revealed this. The prorogation plot was known well before. How was it, Mr. Speaker, that I was able to know about this matter in the early hours of the morning, before it was announced, before you had been told, Mr. Speaker, before the Cabinet had been told, Mr. Speaker, before the country had been informed, Mr. Speaker? How was it that journalists were able to know? How was it that I was able to know? And yet number 10 Downing Street was still denying that this gag was going to go forward. That night. They were denying it days before, and yet the decision, as was revealed, was taken on the 16th of August. So that goes to the heart of these motions today. This is about trust. It's about trust in a government that cannot be trusted. It's about our constituents' lives, the issues that matter to them, that go well beyond Brexit, Mr. Speaker. And it's about the national security and safety of this country. That is why the Yellowhammer documents should be made public, so that we all know the true risks to this country of a no-deal Brexit.
Thank you. The Chancellor of the Duchy. Michael Gove.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate after a number of important, serious and passionate speeches. And it's also important that we pay appropriate regard to this humble address, standing as it does in the name of my right honourable and learned friend, and supported as it has been by 3 distinguished QCs in 2 of the 3 jurisdictions of these islands. And important issues are raised by this humble address. There is a request implicit in this address for full information about the consequences of leaving the European Union for this House. And I would emphasise that the opportunity for not just members of this House, but citizens in this country to make sure that they're familiar with all the consequences and indeed the opportunities of leaving the European Union is at the heart of the government's information strategy. Some have suggested that it's somehow propaganda. Far from it. It is an effort to ensure that the facts are laid out in an accessible way to every citizen. So whether it is a simple matter of individuals knowing what their rights might be if they happen to be UK nationals abroad, or if it's businesses who require to know what the customs procedures are in order to accommodate themselves, not at this point, whether businesses need that information in order to export, That is all in the public domain. Indeed, that is not the only thing that is in the public domain. It is also the case, as a result of a court case that's been brought by the Honourable and Learned Lady and others, that we have in the public domain the submission that went to the Prime Minister on which he made his decision. Now, it's ordinarily not the case that submissions like this, government policy, which rests on it, are made public, but quite properly, following a duty of candour in respect of that judicial review, that information was published. And there it is in black and white, the reasons which were put to the Prime Minister for going down this course of action, and indeed the reasons that, and the reasons that led him to make that decision. Now, I would say that it's not unprecedented, but it is rare that such a degree. I'm always happy to give way to the Honourable Lady. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm very grateful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for allowing me to intervene upon him. The Right Honourable Gentleman will, of course, be entirely aware that last Thursday, during an urgent question, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who is a very good appointment indeed, made it quite clear that he had not been consulted by the Prime Minister.
It's grateful.
He had not been consulted by the Prime Minister about the plan for prorogation. He was only told just before it was made publicly announced. And therefore, where we have a Secretary of State in Northern Ireland who is facing a perfect storm of the possibility of a no-deal Brexit and also no functioning assembly and no expectation of one any day soon, how can it possibly be that the Minister is telling the House here that the Prime Minister had a paper which he didn't even share with the Cabinet?
Minister.
Well, there are at least two important points that the Honourable Lady raises. The first is we are, of course, absolutely aware that whatever the impacts of a no-deal Brexit, they are likely to be more acute in a number of ways in Northern Ireland. And the Honourable Lady is absolutely right that it extends not just to the economy of Northern Ireland, but also to security considerations. And let me take the opportunity to pay tribute to the work of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, who've been very clear about what the risks are and their attempts to mitigate them. On the broader point, it is the case that submissions that would go to the Prime Minister would not normally be circulated to the whole of the Cabinet any more than submissions that go to an individual minister would. And this goes to the very heart of what is being requested here. It is the case that that submission is already there, but we're now being asked to give this House and indeed the world not just those submissions, but every possible communication that any civil servant might have entertained beforehand in helping to advise the Prime Minister on what the correct course of action is. And it is a basic principle of good government, observed by governments, Labour, Conservative and Scottish National, that there should be a safe space for the advice that civil servants give. And the Cabinet Secretary, when he appeared before the Procedure Committee, made it clear this convention that advice should be private has applied to governments of all parties throughout the history of the civil service. And he said that the humble address, the particular procedure that we're debating today, has a chilling effect, which is to the severe detriment both of the operation of government and the public record of government decisions. That is the Cabinet Secretary's view, and it is interesting that my right honourable and learned friend, when he said that of the nine people whom he names, only one was a civil servant. 4 are civil servants, including the Cabinet Secretary, and he has been clear, as administrations of every colour have been clear, that they do not disclose this information. Indeed, sometimes, and I listened with care to what the Honourable Lady said, sometimes there are some administrations that don't even reveal legal advice when it doesn't exist. Because she told us that if we had an independent Scotland, that the rules and procedures and practices in an independent Scotland would set an example to us here. But it is the case that the First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, told the BBC that he had legal advice on the impact of Scotland being independent in Europe, and then when he was asked to publish that legal advice, he spent £20,000 of Scottish taxpayers' money fighting that and saying that there should be no freedom of information request granted. And then eventually, when the court found out what had happened, there was no legal advice at all. So I will take no lectures from the Scottish Nationalist Party about trust or transparency. No, absolutely not. And what is being asked? No, thank you. What is being asked of this House is more than just the publication of advice. It is also the case that private communications of a variety of public servants are about to be published if this humble address is published. And it is the case that the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman did not ask specifically in this humble address for, no, thank you, he did not. I'm not scared of the truth. Alex Salmond was scared of the truth, which is why he spent my mum and dad's money to hide the truth. No, I won't give way. Now, it is the case that if the humble address had been shaped in such a way to say that official advice was requested, that is something that the government would have sought to cooperate, I should say, with the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman about. But it is the case that this is a trawl, a fishing expedition, in which every single communication from public servants is being requested if it has anything to do in any way with prorogation. If there are officials who are communicating, if there are special advisors who are communicating with one or other about personal matters, then that would be within the scope of this humble address. It is unprecedented. It takes a coach and horses through our data protection legislation. It is questionable in the right of the Article 8 rights that individuals have under the ECHR. And it would, for the first time, say that that this House of Commons, by a simple majority vote, can say that any individual's communications should be rendered transparent. Do members realise what they are doing? It is not the case that any criminal offence is alleged. The sole purpose of this is in order to determine what may or may not have been the private opinion of civil servants and special advisors. The idea that in order to discern exactly what they thought, we will trample over data protection law, ECHR rights, and the principle of safe space is an unprecedented example of those who claim to revere, those who claim, no. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the right to take any intervention I wish, and I will in a second.
Order! There's so much noise that it would be understandable if the Chancellor of the Duchy were unable to hear his Right Honourable and Learned friend who was bidding to intervene. Whether he accepts the intervention is a matter for him. It's important that interventions that are attempted should be audible. The Chancellor of the Duchy.
I shan't take any interventions because I know that it's important that I make progress. But I wanted to underline, these are propositions being put forward by people, and I believe them, who say that they take the rule of law seriously, but in their desire to rifle through the private correspondence of individuals, they set aside legal precedent, they set aside the good workings of government, they set aside the rights of individuals. Now, let me turn briefly to the particular part.
Order.
It's a point of order, not a point of frustration, Mr. Ian C. Lucas.
A point of order, Mr. Speaker. I wrote to the Secretary of State on the 5th of August asking him a specific question when he knew about the illegal payments of vote leave. He has not answered my letter and he refuses to take an intervention. I've raised it in this debate again. How will I get a straight answer on trust from the Secretary of State?
Persist, man, persist by asking further questions or sending follow-up letters. Keep buggering on at all times. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is the case that in the Honourable Gentleman's own speech, he answered his own question. He explained that I had said to Dermot Murnaghan on Sky News exactly when I knew about these payments. So he can ask as many times as he likes for me to repeat the answer, but I gave the answer months ago. Now, talking of politicians who cannot see what is in front of them, we come to Yellowhammer. Now, the point has been made that it is critical that we share with this House as much as we can, and I absolutely committed to that. And in the evidence that I gave to the exiting the European Union Select Committee last Thursday, in the evidence that I gave, I made clear, and I'm very grateful to the chairman of that committee for allowing me to do so, that we wanted to publish and would publish a revised Yellowhammer document. But it is also important to recognise that I'm afraid that the Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the European Union described Yellowhammer as both an impact assessment and a likely scenario. I was clear in the evidence, which was accepted by the chairman in that committee, that it was neither an impact assessment or a likely scenario. The honourable gentleman says that he wants scrutiny of our no-deal assumptions. But when that scrutiny is given, and when the facts are in front, he either seems not to be interested, not to read, or not to know what is being said. He says he wants scrutiny, but when he gets scrutiny, he can't be bothered to take account of it. I'm happy to give way.
Well, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. I'm sorry to take him just back to this issue about prorogation and its origins. Would he like to explain at the dispatch box why it is that no affidavit was filed by any official relating to the circumstances in which prorogation was decided upon? Because he will understand that the suggestion is that, in fact, the explanation given by the government is inaccurate, and that the decisions and work on proroguing this House to prevent us from scrutinising the Brexit process was taken earlier, and that there is evidence of it in the interchange of communications between special advisers and others in government.
Well, I know what the right honourable learned gentleman suspects, and he's been fair in laying it out clearly. But the question that this House has to ask is, are we prepared? Are we prepared? The question before the House is this. The question before the House is this. I am answering the question. The question before the House is this. We know what the right honourable and learned gentleman is concerned about, and we know what his concerns are. But are we willing, in order to satisfy his curiosity on this point, to make sure that data protection legislation, to make sure that the EHRC, and to make sure that the standard practices of government are overturned? I should say to my right honourable and learned friend that we have published in unprecedented detail, in conformity with the duty of candour, all the information required.
Resume your seat, Minister. We're most grateful to you. Yes. The question being now put, as many as other been say aye. All the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is the motion as on the paper. As many as of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division. Clear the lobby. Order. Order. The question is the motion as on the paper. As many as other opinions say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Tell us for the ayes. Nick Dakin and Bambos Charalambos. You just can't get the staff these days to control, colleagues. Yeah, take a seat on the front bench. Well done. Yeah. And tell us for the noes, Stuart Andrew and Ian Stewart. An